Okay, let's first raise the unanswered questions. Which farm products from the US will be allowed? That's not clear. Will India stop buying Russian oil? The Russians say they have received no communication that India will stop buying Russian oil, as Donald Trump has claimed. India has also made no clarifications. Will India buy costlier US and Venezuelan oil and energy? No clarity on that as yet. Will the US withdraw the 5% tariff that it had imposed in 2019 on countries like India? Probably, but we need complete certainty on that. Over how many years will India buy the 500 billion US goods? Government sources are saying it will be over the next 5 years. But again, we await a formal clarification. 0% Indian tariff on certain US goods? Possibly. But which are those goods? Still unclear. So there are still big questions to be raised, and I want to raise now the big questions before our debate. Here on this program, you get the questions that other channels don't raise. Trump versus Modi, who blinked? Win-win or one-sided deal? Can mercurial Trump be trusted? Indo-US deal. Has Modi shown that it's the art of the possible and of patience? Joining me now are special guests. Ambassador Atul Keshap is President US-India Business Council at the US Chamber of Commerce in Washington, D.C. Syed Akbaruddin, former permanent representative of India to the UN, one of our more distinguished diplomats. Lisa Curtis is Senior Fellow and Director of the Indo-Pacific Security Program at the Center for New American Security. We also hope to be joined by Nisha Biswal, partner in the Asia Group and a former Assistant Secretary of State for South and Central Asia. I also have two guests who I recorded with earlier. Mr. Grossman is joining me. Derek Grossman, National Security and Indo-Pacific Analysis Professor at the University of Southern California. He joins me from Los Angeles, and Dr. Mukesh Aghi, President and CEO of the US-India Strategic Partnership Forum. Both of them are recorded earlier. Do keep that in mind. But I want to go to my live guests first. And I want to come to you, Syed Akbaruddin, because you've tracked India-US relations, diplomacy. Should we see this, as the government says, as a win-win deal, or await the details before we can celebrate?
So, Rajdeep, first of all, let's acknowledge that this is not a classical trade deal or a classical trade agreement. It's a Trump-era tariff declaration. What happens in these sort of deals are the announcements come first, public sentiment and markets move. The legal text comes later, and it's not new only with India, it's with other countries too. So if you want to have a comparison, maybe you could look at, in terms of a peace settlement, first there is a truce or a ceasefire, and then a settlement is worked out with the details. And that's where we are. We've moved into a truce, and now the settlement is being worked on. And as the Indian Minister, Mr. Piyush Goyal mentioned, that the final details are being worked out. So let's understand that this is where we are in the phase. So
no, but then how do we celebrate? With due regard, Mr. Akbaruddin, then how do we call it the daddy of all deals, celebrate, if you're saying that? Because in such deals, then the devil can lie in the details. We've seen what Donald Trump has done in the past with countries like South Korea.
Sure. But let's look at what is not contested. That the tariff stack that we had, which was 50%, which was punitive in nature, that nobody is disputing, that is coming down to 18%. Sure. So that's not an issue of debate. 18% is a substantial reduction, not because it was lesser before, but because the world has changed. That world of 3 to 4% of tariff is gone. The new world, where Indian products are competitive at about 20%, we got 18%. So that's the big achievement there, that today, what was 6 months earlier not possible is now possible. And that's an achievement. But we also need to see it in broader terms, Rajdeep. Tariff amounts are one aspect. But the India-US relationship is not only about tariffs. It's about investment. It's about innovation. It opens up all these other factors. Finally, let's not forget the geopolitical significance of this deal. India's long-term central challenge lies with our northern neighbor. And we can't take on two big powers simultaneously. So if we have made peace with one so that we can address the challenges of the other neighbor. So geopolitically, economically, and politically, this is a big deal. It's only that we have to find out the details. But the broader trajectory is pretty well clear to all of us.
I think that's very well put, Syed Akbaruddin. Ambassador Keshap, after a summer of turbulence, of an unsettled environment where Donald Trump unilaterally decides that India will have 50% tariffs, including 25% penalty for buying Russian oil, do you believe that the announcements in itself signal the importance of this relationship, and therefore it should be seen in that context before we go into the nitty-gritty of the deal, that the fact that these two democracies have finally got their relationship at least on the right track, that what was haunting this relationship over the last 6 months was this tariff barriers that the US had put up. At least those are slowly but surely being withdrawn. We now go back to 18%. And that's much better than many of our neighbors.
Absolutely, Rajdeep. You know, I take a very long view of US-India relations, and this deal agreement sends a very powerful psychological message. If you think about it, when negotiations happen between governments, virtually everything across the landscape of the bilateral relationship gets paused while those negotiations are taking place. Now, that's not to say that the important work of counterterrorism and law enforcement and national security didn't happen, but they do get subordinated to a negotiation process. When the two leaders announce that a deal has been struck, then it's almost like ending the pause button and hitting the play button on a wide variety of initiatives. So Minister Jaishankar is in Washington today for a critical minerals summit tomorrow. That's very important. Our countries need to talk about the nuclear renaissance. We need to talk about the future of the energy economy of the world, semiconductors, quantum computing, AI, defense production. The list is endless, but this announcement sends a very powerful psychological message, not just across the two government landscapes, but across the business communities who are investing and trading in both directions and crave predictability. So I'm very happy about the psychological impact. I think you will see the delight in the details, not the devil in the details. At the end of the day, it is clear that both bureaucracies put in a lot of work. Ambassadors Gore and Quatra deserve a lot of credit for being the catalysts. Piyush Goyal, Jameson Greer, so many folks worked so hard to bring this to where it is. And I think what you've seen is a great deal of willingness by both bureaucracies to be flexible, to try new things, to advance the meta objective of $500 billion in trade in goods and services between the US and India. We're still woefully underpowered. And then to move on all of the other elements of our agenda.
You know, there's a word that was just used, predictability, Lisa Curtis. How do you have predictability in a Trumpian world order? I mentioned South Korea. We've seen with other countries, Donald Trump arbitrarily can suddenly decide one day that he's going to impose fresh sanctions or tariffs. We're seeing it now with Iran. And that has put, you know, he wants countries that deal with Iran will have sanctions imposed on that. That compromises potentially, and I'll come later to Syed Akbaruddin on this, the Chabahar port project. Should we, though, should we trust Donald Trump? When Donald Trump tweets in the manner that he does, unilaterally announces, for example, that India will stop buying Russian oil, should we see Donald Trump as someone who's trustworthy, a trustworthy ally and a predictable ally?
Well, certainly, President Trump is less than predictable. We've seen that on many fronts. But I think when it comes to the US-India trade negotiations, he was pretty consistent about wanting to see India stop importing Russian oil. This was a constant in what he talked about when he talked about the US-India trade negotiations. And the fact that he said, you know, he got agreement from Prime Minister Modi to halt Russian oil imports, I think that was a major part of why this deal was concluded. There was probably so many other factors that went into it. Perhaps it was seeing the conclusion of the India-EU free trade agreement last week that also put some pressure on the Trump administration to get this US-India trade deal across the line. But I think it is a win-win for both sides. It's a win for India because now we see the tariffs reduced. These were some of the highest tariffs in the world that India faced, 50% tariffs, quite remarkable. And so now seeing those come down to 18%, that will be a huge relief to Indian traders and exporters. And it's a win for the United States because, as I have said many times on this station, as well as many other outlets, that the U.S.-India relationship is important for strategic reasons for the United States. And I think it was important for this deal to be closed so that the U.S. could get back to the job of building Indian trust, trying to get that relationship back on track. It's not going to be easy, even though this is a significant step forward. And as Ambassador Keshap said in his remarks, it's an opportunity to start moving forward on all those areas that U.S. and India were cooperating, whether it's critical minerals, AI, pharmaceuticals, you name it. There's so many areas there are opportunities for our two countries to move together. That work can it's been
Right.
continuing, but now it can start up in earnest. But I think that the point is this is not going to be easy. And also, let's not forget, it's not only the trade issue that caused the tensions in the relationship over the last 10 months. It's also about how the Trump administration handled the aftermath of the India-Pakistan conflict and the differences between the two sides on how that ceasefire came about. So I think, we have taken a major step forward, but we're not out of the woods. There has been a stumble in the relationship. There's been some damage done to the trust levels, and that's not going to come back overnight.
Okay, I'm going to, I've heard all three of you, and I think all three of you believe this is a positive step forward. In an uncertain, unpredictable world, it at least brings the relationship back on track. I think that would be a fair way to put it. Now, one of the few guests that I've spoken to today who actually has a different view is Derek Grossman. I spoke to the professor from the University of Southern California earlier, and I began by asking him, going through your tweets today, you're putting a few red flags on this Indo-US trade deal. You seem to suggest that this is actually a win only for the United States, based purely on what Donald Trump has said. Why don't you believe this is a win-win deal for both countries? Why go only by what Donald Trump has said?
Thanks for having me, and I don't. I think that when you consider how before Trump, the tariffs on most Indian goods into the United States were at approximately 2 to 3%, and now post the deal with Trump, you have an 18% tariff, reciprocal tariff. Whereas most, American goods are going to be getting in at a much lower rate to India. I can't really see how this is a good deal for India. And that I think is very unfortunate because what we've seen over the last 2+ decades is a coming around on both sides, right, to making the relationship better. And that I think is now kind of just muddling along. When Modi visited the White House early last year and met with Trump, it seemed like the relationship was going to pick up right where it left off. And it did for maybe a couple of months. But as we all know, the summer of 2025 was very bad for the U.S.-India strategic partnership.
But that's precisely it. The summer of 2025 suggested a lot of instability, discord, tariffs being raised unilaterally, including the penalties. Given that fact, surely the new reality that the countries have come to an agreement of 18% reciprocal tariffs should be a sign that they are moving in the right direction, Professor Grossman.
Yeah, I think in general, a deal is better than no deal, right? That means the two countries are getting along. The free trade agreement was in draft form for at least a year, probably longer than that. And there was a lot of leadership politics at play. Will Modi call Trump in order to sign the deal? Will the, some of the finer details of it be worked out on the Indian side rather than the American side, right? And so, yeah, it's nice to have a deal, no doubt. But I guess what I'm arguing is that the deal is unfair to India. And I think that India should have tried to get much better than 18% as a reciprocal tariff. I mean, when you look by comparison at some of the other countries in your own region, right, they are getting maybe a little higher than 18%, but not much higher, right? I think Pakistan in particular is at 19%, right? So to kind of put India in that same boat,
Right.
I think the United States is doing India a disservice.
You want to respond to that, Syed Akbaruddin? Is the US the sense that one gets? America is calling the shots, Syed Akbaruddin, is what Professor Grossman suggested there to me at the moment. How do you look at it? Do you believe that, look at the US Agriculture Secretary unilaterally putting out a tweet saying, we're now going to, this deal is a win-win for US farmers. Our trade deficit on agriculture with India is very high. It's going to come down lower. This has, of course, led to uncertainty. Will agriculture be opened up? If so, to what extent? Piyush Goyal says, no, it's protected. These are the concerns. Do you believe that the Americans are trying to call the shots, put some kind of pressure on India, as is being suggested, particularly by opposition parties?
So, Rajdeep, we need to understand that what this deal does is it buys India space. It buys India space to sell more than what it was doing recently, to invest more, get more investments, and to negotiate from a steadier footing. Now, relief that it was previously less at 2 to 3%, that world is gone, Rajdeep. To be fair, it's now only comparative relief. So, if you look at it between India and Pakistan, the tariffs were equal prior to the reciprocal tariff. So it's not worse than what it was before. And finally, I think we need to understand relief will never be permanent. Reversals will arrive. But we need to be able to engage. And this deal buys us the space to re-engage across the board and to try and steady the relationship in a manner that we can address challenges in the past. Now, you said that there could be a risk of President Trump changing his position. Yes, of course, there could be a risk. And that's how, but the risk is now lesser compared to what it was in the past. And all we can do is to look at the comparative equivalence, not some generic thing which was there in the past, which doesn't exist. The US doesn't believe in the most favored nation treatment to anybody now. So we can't expect them to say, well, I want to go back to 2% or 3%, that's out. Having said that, I also want to address one other issue, which was on the Russian oil that you raised in a generic manner. We need to understand that India was buying Russian oil not because of some ideological interest or some affinity with Russia. India was buying Russian oil because that was the best deal in a world where oil prices were fluctuating and the Russians were willing to give us at a lower price. Right. But now with these other tariffs, if you do a calculation of do we gain from Russian oil or do we lose in terms of tariffs, you will realize that we are perhaps losing more than we are gaining. So it's a spreadsheet, and arithmetic is the decisive factor here, not any political arm twisting, because arithmetic, the costs of to the economy of all this is what matters. And I think we will be pragmatic enough to see if the economy is being affected adversely across the board. We need to shift like we shifted before.
Okay, yeah, you used an important word that this deal gives us space. Presumably it gives us space, it gives us time to perhaps at least for now get this relationship back on track. But there is one critical issue, which is agriculture. And that has been a red flag that India has drawn. I just want to play what Prime Minister Modi has said, because the opposition has gone ahead and said the interests of India's farmers could be compromised. Listen to what the Prime Minister had said earlier, and then I'll come to my guests again.
हमारे लिए अपने किसानों का हित सर्वोच्च प्राथमिकता है। भारत अपने किसानों के, पशुपालकों के और मछुआरे भाई बहनों के हितों के साथ कभी भी समझौता नहीं करेगा। और मैं जानता हूं व्यक्तिगत रूप से मुझे बहुत बड़ी कीमत चुकानी पड़ेगी, लेकिन मैं इसके लिए तैयार हूं। मेरे देश के किसानों के लिए, मेरे देश के मछुआरों के लिए, मेरे देश के पशुपालकों के लिए आज भारत तैयार है।
So the Prime Minister making it clear in an earlier speech that the interests of farmers will not be compromised, but what the US Agriculture Secretary said has led to some confusion. Nisha Biswal, partner in the Asia Group, former Assistant Secretary of State for South and Central Asia with us also. Nisha, your first comments on that. Do you believe that this is a win-win deal for both, or as critics in this country are suggesting that particularly on agriculture, there's still some element of uncertainty that America wants to use this deal to get greater access to India's markets?
Well, first of all, I think the two are not mutually exclusive. Yes, this is a win-win deal. I think India needed to get those 25% energy tariffs off its back. It needed to be in a more competitive space with vis-a-vis its peers. And so moving to an 18% rate is, I think, critically important. And you've seen the market sentiment in India reflect that. And that's a good news story. Nonetheless, there's a lot that we don't know. We don't know what particular areas the tariff lines have been negotiated down to zero. We don't know what that means in terms of market access for agriculture. We know that this is an area of sensitivity for India. It's also an area of great political priority for the United States and for the president. So I imagine that if not in the current agreement, that this will be a topic of further conversation in subsequent negotiations, because what we have between the U.S. and India right now is not a comprehensive trade agreement of the nature of what India and the EU concluded. It is a phase one agreement. That means that there are additional chapters yet to be negotiated, and I imagine we'll see more negotiation on agriculture in the future to find some space, some strategic space that might create opportunity for the U.S. and still also address some of the sensitivities for the Indians.
Dr. Atul Keshap, you want to respond to that as someone who heads a US-India Business Council. When I look at some of the statements coming from the US on agriculture, the trade representative has said, he has been quoted officially, yes, there are some agriculture areas that are protected. Now, how does one define that? Does that mean that that's where, as you said, you believe that the devil doesn't lie in the details? Many fear that's where the devil could lie. Is that a misapprehension?
No, I don't think so, Rajdeep. I think that, in fact, the notion that this is one-sided is laughable. Nisha and Lisa and I collectively spent decades negotiating with India on behalf of our government when we were in government service. Indian negotiators are tough, they're smart, they're prepared, they bring coherent arguments. And in the recent past, we had begun to negotiate with India in a kind of a joint and collective approach toward things to solve problems that we both face. And it is that sense of collective destiny that is really important. And I think that the US and India have signaled through this agreement that not only are we going to make this an area of convergence, but that this is the beginning of, as Nisha said, many chapters to come of work between the US and India.
But there are strong domestic constituencies in both countries. The Americans who want to put their farmers first, and India, which needs to protect their farmers.
Well, look, Rajdeep, negotiating in a democracy is always a challenging thing. You can't negotiate in public, you have to negotiate in private. So the two governments have put in a serious amount of work. There's been a year of talks. I think the business communities of both countries are feeling very positive about what this deal could mean in terms of investments and trade to come. And I think this is the beginning of a project of work that could take our countries to greater heights for both of us. And so it is absolutely win-win, because the negotiators are serious people. And I think that we can find mutual accommodation in ways that are good for both of us. I just don't think this is something you negotiate in public, because in an open, participatory democracy, that becomes a very awkward way of doing things.
I also spoke earlier to Dr. Mukesh Aghi. As I said, we've got a variety of voices today. He is, of course, with the US-India Strategic Partnership, its head. And I asked him these concerns over agriculture. While the government of India, Dr. Aghi says they will not allow the interests of farmers to be compromised, is that a niggling area? Or given the warmth that has been shown in their tweets, at least by the two leaders, do you believe all contentious issues are now overcome?
Well, one thing I can say is that the deal does not infringes on the red lines India had put on agriculture and also on dairy. But there is some kind of understanding that for the ethanol, we may be able to bring in some corn into the country, or bring in some kind of cheeses which India does not produce. But overall, it protects the red line which India had painted to the US in negotiation.
Right, but do you believe, Dr. Aghi, that India can trust Donald Trump, someone who's all warmth one moment, then imposes 50% tariffs? The trust factor, is that something that you believe that he's someone, once he's signed on a deal, will stick to it?
Well, you have to basically take what you have and run with it without doubting as to it will change. We have seen sometime changes happening, but I think it's a time to celebrate. We have a tariff which is 18% as compared to China, which is 34%, or other Asian nation. So I think from that perspective, I would say let's focus on see what else we need to do after this trade deal to bring in more US companies' investment, to bring in more job creation effort by exporters from India into the US.
You know, Lisa Curtis, there is one other key area. Why did Trump agree at this moment? Do you believe, you mentioned earlier, pressure from the India-EU deal, the mother of all deals, was that the reason for the pressure? The opposition here suggesting that Donald Trump has some leverage over Prime Minister Modi, even linking it to the Adani case. Rahul Gandhi's linked it to that in the United States. What do you believe has eventually led Donald Trump, since he made the announcement first, to finally say, look, I'm bringing India back to 18%? What do you believe was the real turning point, the trigger?
Well, I think we're going to have to wait and see what comes out, in the next 24, 48 hours to really understand that. But I will note that a week or so ago, the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, mentioned that India had reduced its imports of Russian oil. They had the numbers in from the last month, and it did show that India had drastically reduced its imports of Russian oil. So that could have certainly had something to do with it. I come back to that point that this was a consistent point that President Trump raised in relation to the trade negotiations. And also Modi, he was very consistent about protecting Indian farmers. So it's not surprising that he has held the line on that issue. And we don't have the details, but I think by Jamieson Greer coming out and saying, well, actually, there are still going to be some tariffs on in the agriculture sector, tells us that Prime Minister Modi probably did hold the line on those issues that are most important to Indian farmers. So I think what we have here is a true compromise. Both sides had to compromise something. That is, the art of the negotiation and how we, have finally gotten to this trade deal. But what, finally convinced President Trump, I think it's very difficult to say. But I do think it probably had something to do with the numbers that came in last month about India's reduction of Russian oil imports.
Nisha Biswal, do you agree that India's reduction of Russian oil dependence was the turning point? President Trump has also said India has agreed to buy oil from the US and Venezuela. I mean, it almost seems as if Donald Trump appears to have managed to dictate terms in that sense.
Well, I do think that the reduction in Russian imports played a significant role, but I think it was probably a number of different things. One, certainly the India-EU deal did get attention in the United States. We saw comments from Secretary Bessent. We saw comments from Ambassador Greer on the India-EU deal, and you know, the fact that we had a very consequential deal that had been almost 98%, concluded between the U.S. and India, but that was sitting on his desk, so to speak, perhaps did create a little bit of pressure and incentive for the U.S. to get its own deal done. Just to ensure that U.S.-India trade was not disadvantaged as India-EU trade starts to pick up. So I think that there's something to that. But I also think that there is important areas of strategic convergence between the U.S. and India that also had stalled to some effect because of some of these tensions in the trade relationship. Right. And having a trade agreement in place and getting rid of some of those irritants also allows for greater cooperation. And you see that with Minister Jaishankar in Washington this week for the Critical Minerals Summit. There is a common challenge that the U.S. and India face with Chinese dominance in critical mineral supply chains and in some of these other strategic sectors. And in order for the U.S. and India to be able to work together to address some of those challenges, perhaps we needed to get this irritant out of the way. On trade.
I raised this question of Russian oil also with Derek Grossman, who I spoke to earlier, that Donald Trump saying in that tweet, Derek, that India will stop buying Russian oil. India has not said that officially. The Russians have said they've received no communication to that effect. Is this classic Donald Trump unilateralism at work to try and set the agenda so that he can claim some kind of a domestic political victory?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. But I guess what I'm also arguing, I agree with you, right? But I'm also arguing that at this particular moment, right, agreeing to 18%, dropping it from 50 to 18% is important. But why was it at 50% to begin with? Shouldn't have been, right? And so India, I think, kind of like what China did early on with the reciprocal tariffs. China did not budge 1 inch. Right. And I think China actually came out in better shape thereafter. Right. I guess my point is standing up to someone like this who's bullying other countries. Granted, he's the president of the United States, the president of my country. It doesn't mean that you have to make a deal with a bully, because frankly, a lot of the deals that we've seen Trump make, they are handshake deals. They are verbal agreements. Very little is usually written out. And even if it is written out, very, very little seems to be adhered to. Right. I'll give you an example. Just last week, the South Koreans woke up to Trump saying, I'm going to reimpose 25% reciprocal tariffs. He had brought it down to 20%, but now it's back to 25% overnight because he was angry at South Korea. So he's a mercurial president. He's unpredictable. He's transactional. We all know that. But giving in any way to demands on reciprocal tariffs, I think, is ultimately going to cause more problems in the long run. It may cause short-term benefits for any country, not just India, for any country involved. You may experience a short-term bump. I mean, I saw the Indian stock market is doing very well now as a result of the news of the deal. But I can almost guarantee you that in the end, Trump will somehow change the nature of the deal somehow.
You want to get a final word on that, Syed Akbaruddin, that in the short run, yes, win-win, we've got the relationship on track. In the long run, where does this relationship go? Has this been a turning point? Will Donald Trump now realize that India is an important strategic partner? Donald Trump has this strange habit of alienating allies and friends and actually cozying up to those who stand up to him, whether it's a Putin or China?
So Rajdeep, in the long run, we are all dead. That said, as you yourself mentioned, this deal buys us time. It buys us space. It doesn't buy us fully trust. But that doesn't mean to say that trust is the only factor between relations, between two nations. There are other factors, and turning that space into a convergence of interest is what we have to work on now. So there is as much work now left to ensure that this deal turns into a win-win situation as it was to get to this deal. So there's a long way ahead. And I think we will have to work towards it because we've had strategic convergence for 20 years. 1 year of dissonance should not derail that. And I think we need to keep that in mind, that there are areas of strategic convergence between our two countries, and they will prove to be resilient despite the difficulties that we've faced in the past and may continue to face in the future too.
I think that's a good positive note on which to end this conversation. I really appreciate Lisa Curtis, Ambassador Keshap, Nisha Biswal, and my guests who we recorded with earlier for joining me, because we've got some very fine voices. I value the fact that you've come and shared your experience. We can only hope that when Donald Trump gets up tomorrow morning, he remembers that he's brought India's tariffs down to 18% and doesn't do a somersault. But for now, after a turbulent summer in particular, there is hope as 2026 takes us forward. India and the US, surely we have a shared partnership to benefit from in the future. Thank you all very much for joining us here on the show today.